We're continuing the book of Ezra. Again, we're just looking at, I'm just trying to mine the useful bits of data from Perek Beis. Perek Beis is the Aliyah of Zerubbabel, in which only a percentage of the Jews came up. And we were looking at the different divisions of groups. I think the last group that we looked at was a composite of the Nesinim and B'nai Avdei Shlomo. They're grouped together, and the families are mentioned by name. Actual families are mentioned by name. And you'll remember the Nesinim. The Nesinim are the Givonim, and the Givonim were of the 7 nations of Canaan, who made a peace treaty with Yoshua under subterfuge, under fraud, and they were made a servant class for the Mishkan, or later the Beis HaMikdash, in which they were chotvei eitzim. They were cutters of wood, and shoavei mayim, and drawers of water, and a gezerah was made that they could not marry into the Jewish people. So Givonim, they're called Nesinim from the Lashon Vayitnu. They were placed into this class of servitude. And the B'nai Avdei Shlomo are simply the descendants of the non-Jewish slaves of Shlomo HaMelech, who kind of went rogue, meaning they eventually just left their slavery and they mixed into the society at large, but there was still an identification that they were Avadim. And remember that an unfreed Eved Kanani, non-Jewish slave, is not allowed to marry into the Jewish faith. So as I indicated, just to remind you of the critical point, there are 2 distinct reasons why these genealogical lists are important. I know that they bore a lot of people, etc., lists and numbers and names, and we're not reading it pasuk by pasuk either. But there are 2 different reasons why this list is important. Reason number 1 is it's a badge of honor. It's so important to know who were the first people who responded to the call to return to Eretz Yisrael. Remember, most of the Jews did not return. And remember, Eretz Yisrael then was not like today. Ben and Jerry's and Skippy Peanut Butter, whatever it would be. Eretz Yisrael was desolate. There was no buildings there. Every single thing was destroyed. And you're coming back to a desolate, empty country surrounded by hostile enemies that want to destroy you, as well as wild animals. So a list like Perek Beis is really to memorialize the heroes who made that sacrifice. I remember reading once, and it's not exactly this, it's very far from being the same, but there's a certain analogy. Golda Meir, who was the Prime Minister of Israel, and earlier than that, the Foreign Minister, she's the only founding mother of the state. They have the founding fathers, Ben Gurion and these guys, and Golda Meir was the founding mother of the state. So she wrote an autobiography because, she was born in Russia. She actually lived in Milwaukee for a few years. She was a school teacher in Milwaukee, and then she came to Israel in the 1920s. And she describes, these were, you got to give it to them. They were not religious. They were not observant. To some degree, they were anti-religious. So, they're not our role models per se. But there was something about their idealism. She talked about draining the swamps, quite literally, in the north, sleeping with these malaria-carrying mosquitoes, not having, plumbing, and having to build everything. And, this is what she did as a 21-year-old young woman. And so many people were doing that. So that was her thing, but that is even much more so what this group of people faced. So as a result, you read these names that don't make any sense to you. You don't know who they are. Okay, we don't know who they are. But the people at the time that this was written, they knew exactly who these families were. It's like your next door neighbors. And these were honored in perpetuity by being listed in this list. That's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is more practical, and that is, since there are groups who are not allowed to marry into Klal Yisrael, we need to blacklist certain groups. So we mentioned the Nesinim. By family name. We mentioned the Bnei Avdei Shlomo by family name. These are blacklisted. I mean, that's a negative word, but halachically it's necessary. These are blacklisted populations that the regular Jews are not allowed to marry, right? So that's the second function that we have. So I'm just moving down the list, looking at the different categories. And this takes us all the way to Perek Beis, Pasuk Nun Tes, Pasuk 59. So it's a big Perek, obviously. And here it mentions a very, very strange pasuk, and the Gemara in Kedushin has a lot of drushes on this pasuk. V'yeileh ha'olim, and the following people came up from these towns in Babylonia or Persia. Tel Melech, well, literally that means the mound of salt, but these are just city names. Tel Charsha, Karuv, Adan, Imer, these are locations. Now what is it? Lo yochlu lahagid beis avosam bezaram im mi Yisrael heim. They could not show a lineage to establish that they were Jewish. The implication is that everybody else could show that lineage, meaning there was a concept that you had to prove that you were Jewish. Think about that. How many of us, it's funny, in Israel today, we have this process, but it is really kind of a joke because it's not really a proof. If you want to apply for Aliyah, you want to apply for even a student visa. So often you need a letter from a rabbi that you're Jewish. Your own word is not good enough. You need a letter from a rabbi that you're Jewish. So how does the rabbi know to write the letter? The rabbi asks you if you're Jewish. And you say yes. So the rabbi writes the letter that you're Jewish. Now, if you think about this makes no sense at all, because if the rabbi only knows that you're Jewish because you told him that you're Jewish, well, you already said that to Misrat Apanim, but they said, not good enough. You got to have a letter from a rabbi. Unless they figure the rabbi did his own intensive investigation. Sometimes that is necessary. I'm not saying it's always just a joke, but a lot of the time it's just the rabbi. I'm admitting it myself. The rabbi is simply working off the information that the person gives him. Well, today we're a little liberal with this, but in this time, you needed a family tree. You needed a lineage that would trace your yichus to someone who unequivocally was Jewish. To Ruvain, to Yaakov, whatever it would be. This is called, in Yiddish it's called a yichus brief, which just means a letter of lineage. But here it's called a shtar. And it mentions there were a number of families, and they're mentioned by name and place of origin. And they're even given a number, 652 individuals, who were not able to prove that they were Jewish, meaning maybe they were, and maybe they won't, or maybe they weren't. So a circle was drawn around them that people would not be allowed to marry them unless and until they underwent a Gior L'chumra, right? What's the concept of Gior L'chumra? Today we have situations where people cannot always prove that they're Jewish. Let's say they come from the Soviet Union. It actually is a problem. On one hand, they have a passport that says they're Jewish, Zid, or however you pronounce it. On the other hand, in Russia, intermarriage was totally common. And just because somebody has Jew stamped in their passport doesn't mean their mother was Jewish, or whatever it will be. So as a result, generally speaking, when Russians or Jews from the former Soviet Union come to Eretz Yisrael, even if they claim that they are Jewish, and they can even show passport documentation that they're Jewish, it is a very common requirement that the Rabbanut will require what is called Gior L'chumra, or Gior Misafek. What is the concept of Gior L'chumra? Meaning, maybe you're Jewish. We don't know for sure you're a not Jew, but just in case you might be a non-Jew, let's do a conversion just in case. Now, Gior L'chumra has different flavors. Sometimes there's like a 95% certainty you are Jewish, and we're just trying to cover the 5%. Sometimes it's the other way around. It's like 95% you're not Jewish, and you really need this, but there's a 5% chance you're Jewish. So every case is different. But Gior L'chumra can either mean 95% Jewish, 5% chance not, or 5% Jewish, 95% chance not, and virtually any combination in between. So the Russian Jews would be an example of Gior L'chumra. Also, it's often going to be the case that even if somebody had an Orthodox conversion in the United States, the Rabbanut may not recognize many Orthodox conversions. So they'll sometimes they'll say, hey, this rabbi is not on our list of approved people. So they'll make you do another conversion. There are people that have gone through 5 conversions sometimes. They started Reform, which doesn't count, and they upgraded to Conservative, which also doesn't count. All right, so the first 2 don't count anyway, but people go through them. And then they go through Modern Orthodox, which isn't accepted, and then Yeshiva, and there are going to be different levels. So sometimes people go through 5 different conversions. Do you notice on products here in Israel, even hechshers, sometimes there are 5 hashgachos on products? Like, what do you need 5 supervisions? Because some people accept one and not the other one, so you try to get as many as you can get. So some people have to collect conversions for that particular reason. I'll tell you a case in the early years when I was a Rav in Maryland, and I first had to encounter the issue of Gior L'chumra. This involved a very, very, very religious family of wonderful, wonderful. The parents were wonderful, the kids were wonderful, but it happened to be that the mother, she was not a Gioris, but the mother's mother was a Gioris. The mother's mother, now there's these kids' grandmother, converted, and it was under an Orthodox Beis Din. An Orthodox Beis Din back in the 1930s, but the problem was that for most of her life she was not Shabbos observant. So the question is, what do you do with an Orthodox conversion when the person wasn't keeping Shabbos? Now, theoretically, in a perfect world, the conversion shouldn't have taken place. You don't convert somebody who's not keeping Shabbos. One of the requirements of conversion is acceptance of mitzvah. Now, again, I want to clarify, I don't mean there's any problem if a convert stops keeping Shabbos later. That is absolutely not a problem, because once a person converts, they're Jewish. A convert who stops keeping Shabbos is like a Jew who stops keeping Shabbos. That does not affect their Jewish status. Again, I want to repeat that. A ger who later becomes, we talked about this in regular stress, a ger who later stops keeping commandments, that does not affect the validity of their conversion. Absolutely not. The same way that a Jew, by birth, who stops keeping Shabbos, is a Jew, a ger who stops keeping Shabbos is a Jew. But the problem is, if they weren't keeping Shabbos from the very beginning of the conversion, then they shouldn't have been converted. So the shaila that I faced was, you see the ripple effect after many, many years. So here you have a woman who converted in the 1930s, but in those early years, she was not keeping Shabbos. She had a daughter who was treated as a born Jewess. The daughter married a guy, and they have a lot of children who are already in yeshivos, and they themselves are getting married. But you see the domino effect here. If grandma conversion was not valid, then mom is a goy. If mom is a goy, then the kids are goy. right? So what would it be? So the answer that was suggested was, okay, your grandmother had an Orthodox conversion, but just to be 100% sure that you're 100% Jewish without any problems, you should have a Gior L'Chumra. In other words, do a conversion. They were from, so it'd be no problem for them to do a Gior L'Chumra. So it's interesting that logically, that's a simple solution, Gior L'Chumra. But what I didn't realize as a young rabbi was that psychologically, Gior L'Chumra can be very hard on a person. Because here you have a person, let's say this was a girl who was 24 years old. Her whole life, she was living as an Orthodox Jewess. She was born into a frum family. She was living as an Orthodox Jew. And now you tell her, well, maybe you're not Jewish because your mother may not be Jewish, because your grandmother's conversion may be invalid. So we'll just convert. So from a rabbinical perspective, that's a really easy thing. Convert, and then you get married and everything's great. But emotionally, the woman was very distraught because she was saying, does that mean all of the mitzvos that I did for 24 years don't count? So I'm just warning any of you who may be going into the rabbinate that when you deal with Gior L'Chumra, you need to be cognizant of the emotional impact of telling somebody they need to convert. And even if you soft pedal it by saying, oh, there's only a 5% chance that maybe you're not Jewish. But that can hurt. That can hurt. So there's a certain diplomacy. Something you have to do it sometimes, for sure. But there's a certain diplomacy that you need. It's not just something you can throw out there. Because even though it's easy, it's very easy to do. If somebody is from, you can do a Gior L'Chumra in 5 minutes. It is not hard to do, but psychologically it makes a person question their identity. Sorry, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, in regards to the rest of the family, why did they also have to do a Jerusalem?
Yeah, the answer is they all did. This was a family of 7 children. But here is the thing. Here is the interesting thing. I believe that they never told their mother, and the mother did not do a Gior L'Chumra. Mother was a wonderful, wonderful woman. She was a nifter recently. And they just said, the mother, okay, she could not accept that idea. But all the kids did a secret Gior L'Chumra. That was my understanding of the story. Now, the grandmother actually became a Shomer Shabbos too, but it was not at the time of her conversion. So everybody became from, but the question was the conversion valid since the grandmother was not keeping Shabbos at the time? So it's a mess. And by the way, this also explains why the Rabbanut does not accept a lot of American conversions, because if you had Orthodox conversions, which converted somebody who wasn't keeping Shabbos, in the eyes of the Rabbanut, that casts aspersions on all American conversions, except those on the approved list that the Rabbanut knows. I mean, I myself, I did many conversions in America, and I'm not on the approved list. I can tell you that the conversions were not accepted. Again, not because they don't like me, just they have a general rule that they have a closed list that never gets updated. In fact, half the rabbis on the list are dead. They had a closed list that was done 30 years ago, and they don't really update it. So people who convert in America will often have to do a Gior L'Chumra in Israel under the law of return in order to get citizenship and the like. Okay, so forgive me for giving you some rabbinical gossip. Yeah.
If a woman converts at like a young age, and she's not so sincere at birth, she doesn't keep Shabbos, does that conversion still?
Yeah, so that's a very very good point. If somebody was converted as a minor, that's what you're referring to, either as a baby or below bas mitzvah, then it's the other way around. Even if they're not from, unless they can renounce their Judaism. But if they're happy to be a Jew, even if they're not a religious Jew, their conversion is valid. So there is a distinction between the conversion of a minor and the conversion of an adult. The conversion of a minor can be valid even if the person grows up and doesn't keep the Torah, as long as they don't renounce being Jewish. But the conversion of an adult requires Kabbalah's mitzvahs. I understand. Listen, I understand. Well, a 13-year-old is only a kid. What does he know? But okay, what can I tell you? Halachically, a 13-year-old is an adult, and therefore all of the halachos of an adult have to apply to a 13-year-old and a 12-year-old girl. That's going to be the situation. Yeah.
Do Orthodox rabbis in America, I'm assuming also other parts of Eretz, is it a similar situation?
Well, yeah, and the rest of the world is even worse than America. I mean, if you talk about South America, different countries, things are really not so great, not so great there.
So do they have an obligation to tell the person that's converting that, hey, you might want to go to Israel at some point, and our givers that we're giving you is probably not going to be accepted?
Yes, they do have that obligation, and they commonly tell them. Meaning, people who do gerus and chutz la'aretz, and they know ahead of time that the Rabbanut will not accept the conversion, they normally will inform the convert that you may have to go through this again. But in terms of our position, you are already Jewish. Now, what was it with Ivana Trump, who underwent an Orthodox, Ivanka Trump, who underwent an Orthodox conversion? I don't know why it was relevant if the state of Israel, I'm not sure why Israel had to recognize it, but Israel did recognize it, and this was a violation of their own internal rules. But if you have certain connections, you can bypass it. But again, I don't recall right now why they needed to recognize it, but there was some issue there. Yeah.
Two questions. The first one is, we're going back to this idea of the Kanani from Shlomo Melech. Why would it be a sore, or at least that's how it seems like, for them to go through a conversion back then?
Yeah. You're talking about the Avdei Shlomo?
Right. All the people were in question. Why not just...
Yeah, the answer is probably. I don't know, but probably they were not religious. In other words, the issue was they weren't willing to convert, because in order to convert, they would have to accept the mitzvahs, and they were not from. So as a result, they were what they were, and they were not willing to change to a different level. You're correct. Gerus would have been available, although there's a little bit of a complication, though, because in order for the Eved to convert, he would have to be freed. He'd have to be liberated. Now, these guys have been rogue, independent operators for maybe hundreds of years, but you'd have to trace the halachic owner. In other words, somebody owns them. Some descendant of Shlomo HaMelech owns them, and that owner would have to give them a document of freedom. And probably nobody knows who owns them. So that would create another complication there. There's no one who could free them at this particular point. Yeah.
My other question is, before Israel was recreated as a state, how were halachic conversions approved if there was no Israel rabbinate?
Yeah, no, so the answer was that under the British mandate. Now, the mandate itself is not that old. The mandate was from after World War I, 1918 to 1948, just 30 years. So the British mandate established the Rabbanut. The Rabbanut was established under the British mandate. That's Rav Kook, right? Rav Kook was the first chief rabbi of Palestine, and he was so appointed under the British mandate. Rav Yitzchak Herzog was the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel, appointed in 1948. So before the state of Israel, you had the British mandate, which had a rabbanut. Now, before that, where for hundreds and hundreds of years, Israel was under, or Palestine, whatever you want to call it, was under the Ottoman Turkish Empire. So there too, there was no government rabbanut, but there were Jewish communities, and they had it was kind of like America at that point, meaning there was not a centralized rabbinate, but individual rabbis would do conversions in different cities.
But if there was no centralized authority to approve these conversions, then in the status, let's say in Tiberias or Jerusalem, would still have the same weight as in New York or Miami.
Well, it would be different. I mean, in those days, the Rabbanim were accepted and respected, meaning you didn't have the different gradations of orthodoxy that you
see,
have
yeah.
today. I think there was more of a consistency in the standards being applied, even though there was no centralization, but everybody was doing the same thing, so it
Yeah.
was less of a problem. Okay, so that's the category in Pasuk Nuntes and Samach, in which 652 people were demarcated as not being able to prove that they were Jewish. Now, for them at least, they would have the avenue of conversion. Now, whether they took it up or not, I don't know, but this is not like a mamzer matter. In other words, this is a correctable type of problem. Would you, yeah.
We talked about if a minor was converted, like was Garrett said, a minor.
Yeah.
And so when they get older, at age 50, they have an option of renouncing.
Yes.
What if someone wasn't given such an option at 13? Could they renounce it later on?
Yep. So Rav Moshe Feinstein rules that in order to say that your failure to renounce equals acceptance, you had to know that you had the right to renounce. So if the kid knew before his bar mitzvah that he had the right to renounce, and he didn't renounce on the day of his bar mitzvah, he's stuck. But if he didn't find out until he's 45, he can renounce it then. So yeah, that's one of the halachic reasons why if you adopt a baby and convert the baby has to know that he's adopted because he was converted and he has the right to renounce his conversion. Otherwise, you don't really know his Jewish status. Again, I want to clarify, people sometimes make the mistaken statement that somebody who was converted as a child must re-immerse in the mikveh when they're bar mitzvah. Not true. That's not the way it works. It works the other way around. If somebody was converted as a minor, they have the right to renounce their Judaism on their bar mitzvah day. But if they fail to renounce, the original conversion remains valid. They don't have to do anything new. They don't have to go to the mikveh. They don't have to accept being Jewish. It's the other way around. Failure to renounce equals acceptance. So if the kid does nothing at all, that's called an acceptance of Judaism. But Rav Moshe says that is only when he knew he had the right to renounce. So I tell parents of adopted children, do not be too tough on your kid before his bar mitzvah, because if you're putting too much pressure on him, on the day of his bar mitzvah, he might say, I'm leaving. And at that point, you will lose your deposit for the bar mitzvah hall and everything else. Yeah.
When I was in college, I had not just one person, but multiple people. I told them, the person you're dating, you're not going to have Jewish kids. They would respond, don't worry, I'll just convert them.
So let me explain something. Even though I did say, I need to qualify this. I did say that the conversion of a minor is valid even if the kid is non-observant. I did say that, and that's true. But we're not supposed to convert the child unless the parents are committed to a halachic lifestyle. So a non-religious couple who have non-Jewish kids, either they have non-Jewish kids or they adopt, either it's the same situation, cannot just expect a conversion, because if they're not going to raise the child in accordance with halacha, a beis din will not do the conversion normally, right? So that's why that's not an answer. Yeah.
The person converts and they're not observant, but then many years down the line they are observant. Does that?
Yeah, it would seem, well, yeah, that actually would be relevant to the case I was discussing. It seems not. It seems that a requirement for a conversion to be valid is that at the time of the conversion, there is the acceptance of the Torah. So if someone didn't accept and later accepts, I think you have a problem. There would have to be a reconversion of the process. Okay, we'll stop here. Have a good day. Be safe.
Thank you, Rabbi.